I want to start with this quote from Lincoln. I've actually used it at this conference before, but I don't think it's ever been more apposite, and I'm going to finish with one from Jefferson. I also, with deliberate intent, slightly faded the image in background. There's a metaphor in that for current times, if you want to think about it. I want to talk about uncertainty, and I want to talk about how we create a resilience organization. Now, resilience is very different from robustness. If you create a robust system, it can survive unchanged. Resilience is surviving with continuity of identity over time. The system itself may undergo rapid evolution, it may undergo change, but you can see a pathway, a coherent pathway in terms of the way things work. And within those pathways, there are periods of discontinuity. And I'm going to come on to this in a minute when I talk about dominant predator theory or apex predator theory. If we were ever in a period of discontinuity, both within organizations and with society as a whole, then it's now. And there are some very strong metaphors between what is happening in society in this current year. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter books, famously quoted earlier on this year, couldn't we just go back and reboot 2016, which I have an awful lot of sympathy with, right? Leonard Cohen, I thought, was the last straw, but then all sorts of other things happened afterwards. Right? Fundamentally, kind of like industry has been going through that sort of disruption for some time now, but it's in a stage of denial about methods which no longer work. And we can say the same about government. So you can sort of move between government and industry and the not-for-profit sector as I go through this. So in my normal traditional role as professional curmudgeon, I rather like being introduced as a curmudgeon. I find it an attractive proposition, and the world needs far more of us. Yeah? I'm prepared to accept pragmatic cynic as an alternative, but anything which is not, anything otherwise I won't do. The major malaise that has been introduced over the last 30 or 40 years has actually been systems thinking. Complexity thinking, which I come from, is radically different from systems thinking. Systems thinking came in the 1980s. It derived from cybernetics. It grows with the birth of computing. And basically what you see is this fundamental engineering metaphor which starts to underpin society. The assumption is that things can be planned, they can be managed, they can be measured, there is a right answer, we can determine plans. Until the 1980s or 90s, we didn't have companies doing forward planning. But kind of like some big companies grew in that time. And I still find it ironic that American capitalism adopted the planning cycles of Soviet state socialism, with 3-year plans and 5-year plans and targets and quotients, and all the things which went wrong in Soviet Russia have gone wrong in industry persistently ever since. So kind of like the engineering metaphor, the reduction of people to units within a machine. Things like Myers-Briggs, one of the worst examples of a pseudoscience we know, up there with neuro-linguistic programming and others, basically attempts to reduce people into descriptions of little boxes so they can be replaceable units on the factory floor. I actually ran a 6-month proper controlled experiment once when I was in IBM, which proved that astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in predicting team behavior. And I don't think anybody ever forgave me for it because it disturbed people who needed to be disturbed very badly. People are not widgets with competencies that you can define, that you can slot into a process. They're people with hopes and dreams and histories and attitudes and friendships and needs, which are far more complex than the diktats and structures of the modern HR department. And ironically, HR used to be run by ex-military officers, and I would argue it was better then, because they understood the needs of practice, not just the needs of spreadsheet-based management. One of the things I learned when I was in IBM was to employ incompetent people every year, so I'd had people I could give a 0 pay rise to in order that my staff profile was correct. Because there was a profile you had to conform with. I had a high-performing team, so every year I used to take on a really big project which allowed me to have a lot of inadequate people who I could give 0 pay rises to. Now, that's actually a whole series of games, the games that people play. If you don't know the one yet in a project environment about changing your project codes on the last day of the month so nobody can book time to your project, you get a month's breathing space on that, then you really haven't learned how to survive in a corporate environment. In modern corporations and in modern government, playing the game has become more important than actually dealing with reality. Yeah? And that's not sustainable, and we need to change it. So if we look at some of the problems we got, first, techno-fetishism. Knowledge management was really guilty about this. We got obsessed with technology. The famous Nanaka model, the Seki model, then became Bar, the model that launched 1,000 failed knowledge management initiatives, because it assumed that tacit knowledge could be made explicit. And the focus, the fetishism on communities of practice, on codification, on writing things down. Your first bit of science, what you can write down is at best 5% of what you can know. So start to think about what codification has done to a reduction of knowledge, a reduction of critical facility within companies. So don't think knowledge management is exempt from this. It wasn't the only one. The modern one as well, the reduction of artisan capability to a simplistic manufacturing process. The latest on this is design thinking, where designers, if you look at it traditionally, look at architects, look at even visual design, you're talking about 5 to 10 years of apprenticeship. You cannot reduce that to a 2-day course and a rigid process. I could go through lots of other examples of that. We've seen it in IT development. We've seen it with the concept for anybody who's involved in Agile. Scrum is a valuable technique, but to call yourself a master after a 2-day course filling out a multi-choice question kind of indicates the inadequacy of the underlying concept. Mastery is a matter of years. If you don't know it, it takes 3 to 4 years for the brain and the body to co-evolve to actually exhibit the ability to really apply knowledge. It's not just a process of programming the brain, it's a physical activity as well. In Australia, very sensibly, they don't let children drive cars with other than elderly relatives for 2 years after they pass their test, because it takes 2 years for the brain and the body to co-evolve to the point where you can drive and pay attention to a conversation, and that reduces accidents. We've actually started to treat people in knowledge management as people who can follow a process and tick boxes, rather than people who can genuinely apply knowledge under conditions of stress. So that sort of artisan process we've got to come back to. I'm just launching a new master's program at Bangor, which is 3 years of part-time study in the humanities and the sciences. And the application of that theoretical knowledge to a business problem, coupled with a medieval apprentice model of maintaining a journal of your activities signed off by more senior people. That's going to be called the management apprentice, an alternative to MBAs. We desperately need people who understand enough theory to create novel practice. And I'm going to come back to that extensively as we go through. The appalling dichotomy of order and chaos. The assumption that either things are ordered and rigidly controlled or they're chaotic. The basic underlying principle of despots throughout the ages has to be to create a sense of crisis in order that they can be the people to save us. And anybody who knows their history should understand that. I'm introducing a program at the moment in the UK to teach children the history of the Weimar Republic, because people have forgotten that, both within Europe and the United States. If you don't know your history, you are doomed to repeat the errors of the past. And that assumption of order and chaos, and I'm using that at a macro level, at country level, but at a micro level in companies, we hand over power to leaders who promise us things which we actually know in our hearts they can't deliver, because we seek a false certainty, a false hope, rather than to accept the reality of the condition we're in. And that we need to change that. So we get the cult of the measurement. Everything has to be measured. What I fondly call Six Sigma. The reduction of actual human beings to something which is measured, from which deviance isn't possible. Business process re-engineering had value, but Six Sigma is simply business process re-engineering with the worst aspects of American Bible Belt cultism added onto it for good measure. It's a cult, and the high priests of the cult get different colored belts to indicate their cult status. If they're given a black belt, they're exempt from any real work because their job is to impose cult discipline on those who do the work. Anybody who associates lean with Six Sigma doesn't understand lean, because lean, if you read the books, is about eliminating the waste that techniques like Six Sigma create in the first place. The cult of measurement is actually quite dangerous. And if you don't know it, in all cases, and this is a meta-study of all real scientific research, Whenever people are working for explicit rewards, it destroys intrinsic motivation. So if anybody proposes explicit rewards for knowledge sharing, you have misunderstood the nature of knowledge big time. Nobody refuses to share knowledge in the context of need. Nobody will codify knowledge in the absence of that need. Yeah? As Larry Prusak famously said many years ago, if you have $1 to spend on knowledge management, spend 1 cent on the technology and 99 cents on connecting people, because people can connect knowledge bases. An intolerance of deviance. We punish people who don't fit the norm. HR departments create profiles of what you should be, a modern form of neo-colonialism. Yeah? Basically, people are deviant. Deviance is one of our evolutionary advantages. Yeah? Destroying or forcing conformity into companies is really dangerous. And we also see it in the echo chamber effect of social media. We're being forced to sit in camps, and you're only allowed to see things which reinforce that belief. And again, that's very dangerous because it creates schism within society as a whole. And then, as I mentioned already before, the myth of the great leader. Yeah, how many books have you read about leadership? How many people have tried to define the characteristics of a great leader? I mean, I had this argument with Steve Denning some time ago on his book, how can you put Steve Jobs in the same category as Lou Gerstner? They're radically different people. Yeah? The only thing we know about leaders is they're authentic to the situation. And actually, probably 90% of the time, they're just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time in terms of direction. There isn't a causal link. Yeah? We need to see leadership more as a distributed social function. Remember, we evolved for a clan-type community in which roles combine to create leadership rather than one role dominating. That's called a crew in military terms, and something we're starting to bring back in. A crew always has a pilot, but people can change the roles. Yeah, the cult of the leadership, as I say, is dangerous. And then social atomism. In politics at the moment, we have an Anglo-Saxon problem between the US and the UK. Those, interestingly, are the cultures which focus on the individual at the expense of the community. Yeah, the classic divide in politics is society an aggregation of individual self-interests, or are we as individuals defined by the communities in which we grow up? The science supports the latter. We're the only species where cognitive development continues for 2 years after birth. A large part of our brain is physically formed by the people we interact with in those first 2 years. The more you focus on individuals, the more individuals feel guilt, the more mental health problems we have. We're doing a big problem on mental health at the moment, and the isolation, the assumption that the individual is everything, is one of the major causes of that. And again, we get that sort of cult within companies. A failure to recognize that some people work best with other people in different ways. Yeah. I mean, you can comment on this. I mean, the project I did on Myers-Briggs and astronomy, the way we did it is we basically had a very sophisticated survey in which there were only 3 relevant questions: when were you born, where, and at what time? And we got an astrologer to cast horoscopes, including how people would behave as teams. You may not know this, but Aries work really well with Virgos as deputies, but not as Taurians, right? Regrettably, I've discovered that's been true over the years, so I'm quite worried about that one. Right? Yeah. But then we presented it to people dressed up in management speak. Yeah? Now, one of the actual things which came out of that, which was an interesting side effect of the research, is the degree to which people work best when they actually worked with people who complemented their inadequacies. And again, that breaks profiles. So starting to understand that we're social creatures, we're commutarian creatures, we work best in functions where we can distribute cognitive and decision-making within small circles. There's kind of like a natural limit of about 12 or 15 before this breaks down. It's kind of like one of the new models of organizational development. And then we get the tyranny of herds. We don't have the wisdom of the crowds at the moment. We have the tyranny of the herds. Yeah, and just to be clear about this, crowdsourcing is not the wisdom of the crowds. Anything, if you know the basic literature on this, the one I example is a USS submarine. It grounded off the coast of Portugal. It didn't sink. I was corrected on that by an admiral in Norfolk Navy Base. He pointed out submarines are meant to sink. And I learned from that, if anybody has got stars on their shoulder, let them humiliate you in the first 3 minutes, because then they might listen to you thereafter. It's actually quite a good guidance. So we were grounded off the coast of Portugal. Yeah? This is in the 60s, so they don't know where it is, so they gave partial data. That's actually quite important. To diverse groups of experts around the world, none of whom were aware of each other. All of them estimated the position of the submarine. None of them got it right. But a probability distribution of all of the estimates was within 500 meters of the actual submarine. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because we're now working on whole of workforce engagement. Because if you have independent agents making decisions without knowledge of each other, you get a decision support system. If every agent can see what other people are doing, you don't get that. In fact, I've been at think tanks this week and last week where we're looking at the issue of democracy, and one of the big conclusions for those of us from a complexity background is you need to ban opinion polls. Because the principle of democracy is people make individual decisions. With opinion polls, you don't. People are gaming the system, as we saw with Brexit and elsewhere. Yeah? So either way, I could go on that a long time, but let's leave it at that. Right? The next one, for the philosophers amongst you, is the naturalistic fallacy. This is David Hume. You should never derive an ought from an is. The fact that something is the case doesn't mean that it ought to be the case. So the fact that millennials want to do X doesn't mean that X is right. In fact, this myth that has grown up in the last 10 or 15 years, that because kids want to spend their entire life on screens, that we should build systems which assume that, is fundamentally mistaken. We must be the first generation of adults which thinks that whatever kids want to do is right. It's not been a survival characteristic in the history of humanity. Yeah. And we actually now know that if you spend up till puberty on your screen, the chance of autism goes through the roof. Because the nature of the stimulation you're getting reinforces the autism tendency that we all have, and it becomes dominant. If you don't know it, if you read stuff on a screen, you skim it. If you read a book, you absorb it. If you type on a computer, you get a superficial impression. If you write notes with a pen on paper, you get more depth. And again, that's 101 science. This is not something novel. It's been known for some time. And then finally, a fundamental obsession with cases. I've given up on the times where I go into a company and say, we're in a difficult situation, we want some completely novel ideas. So you come up with a novel idea. And then they say, okay, could you give me 5 cases where you've done this before and show me what I'll get? And they just don't see the irony. So let's look at cases and the problem with cases. First, what's called the Cobra effect. This is from the English in India. When the Welsh use English and when we use British has major significance. Yeah? And at the moment, we're thinking of trying to use the word European because being British is a sort of contraindicated at the moment as far as I'm concerned. Right? Basically, the Cobra effect is the English in India. They decided there were too many cobras. So they had a reward. You know that tendency to give rewards for things you want? And they said, for every cobra head brought into the district commissioner, we will give you 1 rupee. For about 9 months, it reduced the cobra population. And then people started to create cobra breeding farms because there was money in cobras. And then the English discovered this, and so they got rid of the reward. At which point, all the cobra farms released their cobras into the wild because there was no longer money in them, and the cobra population went up. Just start to think about that in organizations. When we declare that something is valuable, everybody repositions to match the value regardless of the consequence. 101 anthropology. The minute you write your values down, you just lost them. Because now everybody knows what language to use on their slide set and their proposals. Real values are the way we do things around here that we all understand, but we can't explain until you work with us. That's called an ideation culture in anthropology. Yeah? Making things explicit allows people to effectively game them, and you get cobra effects. The next one, the butterfly effect. Famous cliche. The idea is a butterfly flaps its wings in the Amazonian rainforest, and it causes a hurricane in Texas. Now, This is a bad way of describing it. I know not a lot of Texans. Yeah? If butterflies were really causing hurricanes in Texas, by now they'd have been subject to vigilante action with extreme prejudice involving defoliants. All right? It's not a causal link. The point is something very small, uniquely this time, combines with other small things which produces a massive effect. It doesn't mean the same thing will produce the same effect next time. The thing which started Apple is never going to replicate. The thing which started IBM is never going to replicate. Yeah? Basically, it won't happen that way. We can learn from the past, but we haven't got a causal link that we can imitate. Yeah, but again, people want that. And then we get the Hawthorne effect. This is back in the 1920s. They studied factories. You know, good scientists. So they increased the lighting levels, and people became more productive. Now, in a modern environment, they'd have stopped there. Modern management books have a thesis, and they find cases to support it. Yeah? I'll come back to that in a second. Right? These were reasonably good scientists, so they thought, well, we'll reduce lighting levels, and that theoretically should reduce productivity. Then we got a nice lever. They reduced lighting levels, and people became more productive. Now, the net finding on this, if you do something new and you pay attention to people, it will nearly always work the first time. And it's a massive problem with prototypes and experiments, is mostly they're a Hawthorne effect. You do something with a small group, you put a lot of effort into it, it has a Hawthorne effect, you then assume you can scale it. A fundamental principle, if you don't know why something worked, you should never replicate a what. Until you know why, you shouldn't replicate a what. Yeah, because actually it's dangerous, it won't scale in that sense. And management textbooks these days are appalling. They actually go out and they study things, you know, they assume, I've seen this, I review a lot of papers for knowledge management journals, and you find somebody who interviews 5 chief knowledge officers and believes what they say about knowledge management in their organizations. I find this frankly incredible. I've yet to see, doing ethnography, any correspondence between the reality of organizational knowledge practice and what knowledge management people say at conferences. If you're the chief knowledge officer, you see things the way you need to see them. It's not an inadequacy on yours, it's just the nature of the way we are. But let's even assume they got that right. They then basically, having done that, they derive a general recipe. And then they stop. The scientific method says that you observe cases, you derive a hypothesis, and then other people test your hypothesis to see if they get repetition. And you never see that in the management literature. At the worst event, if you look at the JADE organization stuff, and spiral dynamics is, to my mind, evil, not just an NLP, not just a pseudoscience like NLP. Yeah, basically, the guy has a hypothesis about how companies should be, and he only listens to the aspects of the case which support that hypothesis and publishes it. That is not good science. Lean Startup studied companies who've been successful. He didn't double check. If he'd actually bothered to check the research, people have studied companies which have been unsuccessful, and they do the same thing as the companies who are successful. It's just you've got to market. There are so many startup companies, some of them are bound to succeed. And the way people describe success is different after they've succeeded than if they fail. They actually change their perception. So all of those make cases a very difficult concept to work with. So we need to think about a new way of working. So this is something I developed recently, which is basically looking at the difference between scientific method and observation. So if we look at classical science claims predictive capacity. So it basically is a scientific method. You observe phenomena. You know, if you're in the 18th century, apples drop on your head, and you can actually, apples will continue to drop on the head if you carry on with the experiment, all right? So we observe things, we construct hypotheses, we test those hypotheses. That gives us predictive capability, and that's good news. Yeah? We then get the case-based approach, which dominates social science and management science. This actually observes what's going on in the world and derives effectively explanatory power from that. The good guys, if you look at people like Carl Weick and so on, they don't claim predictive power, they claim explanatory power. So studying cases can give you explanations, it can give you data, it's very valuable. When people claim predictive power, that's when it becomes pseudoscience. When they reduce something which is an explanation into something which is a rigid formula, that's where it goes wrong. And far too much is going down into that bracket at the moment, particularly on things like cultural mapping, employee engagement surveys. There has no real science between them. They've just got a lot of data together based on assumptions that they started with. Yeah. What we're working on is this. This is actually a new theory of method. You look at the constraints of what we know from natural science, and your methods and tools are consistent with those constraints. And again, it gives you explanatory power, but the real difference is you can scale. If all you've got is observations and you don't understand why the observations are producing the phenomena they do, scaling is dangerous. If you can explain why things happened in terms of cognitive neuroscience, anthropology, complexity theory, then you have a dependency on some facts, some reliable science, which allows you to scale. So this is kind of the whole new method. Yeah? And really, these two are valuable. These two are irrelevant. So let's start to run through some of the science. Start with what to date is the best picture I've ever taken. I waited 6 hours for this picture in Kruger National Park, and I'm quite proud of it. Right? This is a dominant predator. Anybody read Good to Great by Jim Collins? Okay? Probably the best example I know of confusing correlation with causation. He goes and studies a whole group of companies who've been successful for a long period of time. Half of them are currently failing, but let's forget that. Let's be charitable, all right? Let's just ignore that one for the moment. Yeah? He goes and studies what they do. The statistics is very good. He identifies characteristics. He runs the mathematics. And he creates a series of characteristics and principles like the hedgehog principle and says this has predictive power. If you follow these methods, you will be a long-term lasting company. That's the basic approach. Yeah? He's actually writing another book on why his predictions were wrong, but I'll be interested to see that when it comes out. All right? I've got a funny feeling it's going to be what we call retrospective coherence. Either way, if you look at the examples with any knowledge whatsoever of evolutionary biology, you say, but you chose the dominant predators. You basically chose the first companies into their ecosystem. And of course, what happens when an ecology is disrupted, a new predator emerges, and then the rest of the ecology organizes around that predator. So they survive no matter how incompetent they are until the ecology shifts again. So let's take two examples. Yeah, IBM in the 1920s repurposes card control systems for sewing machines to get early advantage in computing. And they dominate the field. In the 70s and 80s, nobody got fired for buying IBM, and many people got fired for recommending against IBM, even with better solutions. Yeah, the DEC Alpha was a much better machine than the IBM PC. And then IBM didn't realize that the market had moved from hardware to software. They gave the rights of software away to Microsoft. And ironically, OS/2 was a lot better than Windows. But they didn't have first mover advantage, so Microsoft dominated the next decades. And now Microsoft is failing because it hasn't understood what Apple understood, what anthropologists call objects of material desire. Yeah, it's a lovely phrase. It doesn't matter about the hardware and software. What matters is it looks beautiful and it works. And now the shift has happened. Google, interestingly, I think at the moment are endgame in their core technologies, and Alphabet is about experimenting to try and create a new ecology that they can dominate. Because if you move into a new ecology, it's very easy to manage it. So let's look at this in terms of strategy. So this is combining Handy's S-curves with Moore's crossing the chasm, right, if you want the theory behind this. What actually happens is new ideas come in, and they get an initial bounce. Everybody likes novelty. They just hate it when you want to make it real. I found that in IBM research all the time. You found things which are wonderful, and as long as they were in research and they wrote papers and they went to conferences, everybody was happy. But the minute you tried to move them out into reality, they suffered what was called a white blood cell reaction. I remember somebody very senior in IBM said to me once I just got killed on one of these, they said, Dave, don't take it personally, you were just roadkill. Well, sorry, I take that personally. Right? But they were right. The immune system of the organization couldn't cope with novelty. To go back to Clayton Christensen, the competence in the past prevented them seeing the novelty of the future. And that's the problem with dominant predators. They're over-specialized for their field. So what happens is you get through this, what Moore calls a chasm. After the initial adoption, nothing happens for a bit. And then basically, something starts to dominate the field. You've now got a dominant predator. Your strategy, if you're an organization, or if you're a knowledge management group in a company, is during a position of stability, you have to fit in with the dominant way of working. Trying to be novel will kill you. And you just have to learn to live with that. Yeah? There are approaches on this, and this is what I made my name on using symbiosis, but that's for another day. What then happens is the old way of thinking starts to reach the end of its utility. Things like Six Sigma are actually good indications of that. When the old way of working doesn't work, and people just say, if we just did it harder with more discipline, it might work this time. That's actually a good indication things are starting to fail. Yeah, you get increasing dissent. So at that point, you've got an opportunity to change. So you start to run what are called parallel safe-to-fail experiments. You carve off a portion of your budget, which is immune from orthodoxy, which is effectively a skunk works area, with parallel experiments to see if you can create new meaning. Yeah? If you get that right, yeah, you still got business as usual at that point, but at some point, you then have to find, and this is the key thing on dominant predator theory, you find the lowest energy cost, most adaptive entity in the ecology. Yeah, when the dinosaurs get wiped out by the meteor, it's not the shark or the crocodile who become the dominant predator. It's the first mammal because it's small, it's energy efficient, and it's highly adaptive. Yeah, now, this is a really simple slide, but it's the essence of complexity-based strategy. Where is the ecosystem? Do we experiment with novelty? Do we focus on low-energy products? Or do we start to focus on domination and managing the dominance in terms of the way it works? Now, one of the reasons it's difficult to deal with that is this. Worry if you're going to have an X-ray. This experiment has been repeated many times. I mean, remember, radiologists are highly expert individuals dealing with a very limited information source. And if you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, on one of the X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, over 80% don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. We do not see what we do not expect to see. And training people to be autistic, because actually people who are fully autistic see everything, but then they can't cope. That's the problem. So we have to think differently. So this is a picture from work we're doing on distributed decision support and conflict resolution. This is rather ironic. I did a large conference last year in Florida with about 3,000 intelligence agents in the room, and the bastards announced that Snowden was keynoting at their conference and didn't say which Snowden and put me on first to maximize attendance. All right? And I was rather nervous. I've just had a handbook from a Texas university on how not to antagonize my students, because apparently we have open carry on campus next year. And given that I have never, ever not antagonized a student in my life, I'm probably going to refuse the teaching assignment. Right? Now, the concept that somebody can walk into my classroom with an assault rifle and it's legitimate is, again, one of those signs of the end of days. It's a sign of a society going insane. And I make no apology for that. Yeah? So what we did is we basically presented an infographic on Syria to 2,500 people. We got them to interpret it in real time, and this uses a concept called high abstraction metadata, which is a workshop, not a keynote. It's basically ambiguous, so people don't know what the right answer is and they can't game it. We do this for a lot of work. And basically, everybody in one 60-second period interpreted the infographic, and we drew this map from it. So we can show the dominant views and the minority views, and it means the 17% who did see the gorilla are now highly visible as a minority faction. They don't get wiped out by the dominance. This is one of the really exciting things, by the way, that you can now work in companies. We're now doing whole-of-workforce engagement. So if the executive have a question which has high ambiguity and they don't have 6 months to commission research, they can literally pose an infographic to all of their staff and see how it's interpreted. They don't even have to give away their strategy. In the UK, we're currently using this with one of our intelligence agencies to audit security in government departments because we're auditing attitudes to security, because attitudes are a lead indicator, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah, I was down in Florida yesterday with Gaping Void, some of you will know them, and we're about to launch a series of projects using their cartoons to actually map culture, in which people will choose a cartoon which represents the sort of culture they like to work in. They'll interpret it, we'll draw the maps from the interpretation, and we'll use the same process to screen employees who are seeking jobs. Because actually, culture is more important than qualifications in terms of screening. This ability to see things from many perspectives in real time is critical. And at the end of this, I'm going to talk about a massive new project, which everybody is welcome to engage in that we want to create effectively the entire, for whole countries, 16-year-old kids as a sensor network to answer questions in real time, to overcome the problems of Facebook and social media enforcement of prejudice. But I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so that's kind of like a way of thinking, a way of working. Now, part of this is actually based on complexity theory. And I'm going to go through this briefly to make a point. There are three types of system which exist in nature. Ordered systems. Now, key concept here of containers and connectors. So if something is contained, it has a boundary which I can see. If things are connected, I can see the connectors. Well, not always. We're now talking about rigid connectors, elastic connectors, loose connectors, permeable connectors, and also dark connectors, a reference to dark energy or dark matter, where we can see the impact, but we don't know what they are. And this is actually a key process these days. We map this before we do anything. We don't start with what executives want. We start by mapping things how things are. That's one of the big things on complexity against systems thinking. In complexity, you start with where things are and see what you can change. In systems thinking, you decide where things should be and you try and drag them towards it. Yeah, that's not resilient. Yeah, nudging a current system is a lot easier. So basically, I've got containers and connectors. So if the containers are rigid, the connectors are rigid, I've got a highly ordered system. The example I always give of this in humans is in operating theatres, we count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check it's the same as were there at the start. Yeah. As I get older, I think this is increasing importance. I know the figures on how many surgical instruments were left in people's bodies before they did this, and it's a scarily high figure. So the checklist was valuable. But people don't get this. The context is different. An operating theatre is a highly ritualized environment where the process of scrubbing up aligns individual identity with role. So behavior is possible in the operating theatre which won't work outside. Checklists don't work on a day-to-day basis. They only work in highly ritualized environments. That's, again, the why and the what problem. People take things out of context. Also, the bigger one on this is the amount of work you have to do in a modern organization to work around the rules to make things happen is really very, very scary. There's an old rule on any services business bidding to government. If you didn't write the RFI, why are you bidding? Because in order to get around the rules, RFIs are written in order to match the supplier has been selected. In companies, the work we had to do in IBM to actually be human to staff was crazy. We're finding in British hospitals the only way nurses can give empathetic care to patients is to break the rules. Because people are trying to impose a mechanical model of endpoint discipline on what is organic process of empathy. Yeah, empathy is destroyed by excessive measurement, and empathy is what we need. So order is valuable, but within constraints. Then you've got chaos. Chaos is completely random. If it happens accidentally, you don't want it. If you can contain it, there's an irony here, you get innovation. This is kind of like the Skunkworks project. And what wisdom of crowds does is it actually completely separates and prevents any connection. So if nothing was connected with anything else, you can trust the results. And then we get complex adaptive systems theory. This actually normally has permeable containers, maybe no containers, connections which are dark, connections which are loose. It's not a rigidly defined structure, it's ambiguous. And a simple metaphor for this, if you imagine around a flat surface, you have magnets, yeah? And in the middle of that surface, you have large cast iron discs. If I change one of the magnets' polarity or strength, I can predict what will happen to the disks. If I change 2, I can model it. If I change 3 or 4, I can't do it anymore. In complexity, those are called modulators. Systems thinking calls them drivers. It assumes that you can map them and you can model them. Complexity says you can't. But if I can control enough of the modulators in real time, I can adjust things as things change to get the result I want. And this is the huge switch from traditional market research, employee satisfaction surveys, which run over a once-a-year or a periodic basis, into continuous scanning and feedback loops. We're now doing employee satisfaction over the whole workforce on a weekly basis as an incidental factor of what they do, not as an annual trauma. In 360 feedback, which is one of the worst things that HR departments have ever done to destroy productivity among senior leaders, we're now allowing leaders to nominate people who observe their behavior, interpret that observations onto only positive structures, and the leader sees how, for example, they're balanced between altruism, assertiveness, and aggression, and analytics, and they can modify their behavior. They ask, what can I do tomorrow to create more observations like this and fewer observations like that, moving into fast, real-time feedback loops. And kind of like if you want a basic rule, if the hypotheses of conflicting hypotheses are all supported by the evidence, the situation is complex. And that's why we get conflict. Because actually you can't resolve it because it is inherently unresolvable until the system evolves. You can only understand the complex system by parallel safe-to-fail experiments, because as you interact with the system, you see what the system can sustain. It's an experimental, action-based approach, but within a theoretical constraint. The only one thing I can guarantee about a complex system is the law of unintended consequences. For the Australians amongst you, that's a cane toad. Introduced to Australia to actually try and reduce a pest, and it's now a major pest in its own right. This has major implications for ethics. And I'm not going to go into this in depth, but what we're now saying is, if you look at it, Soviet state planning and the classic liberal concepts of control, Roosevelt over here, assume order. The assumption is the elite can plan the system. That's independent of whether they're right or left. And that's been an underlying assumption for several decades now. Yeah? On the other hand, the assumption of pure neoliberal economics is chaos. If everybody works independently of everybody else and their own self-interest, everything will work out. Well, both of those have failed. Complexity is now starting to introduce a new concept, which is about networks and nodes and communities and coherence at different levels. And also ethically, and this is the important thing, if you know that unintended consequences are inevitable, you are ethically responsible for them, even though you couldn't have predicted the particular consequence. So the larger the intervention you do, the more dangerous the unintended consequences. Which is why one of the golden rules these days in an organization, if you want to run an initiative, do not announce that you are running an initiative. Because what happens? Remember the gorilla? People are making decisions based on past memories. They listen to 5% of what you say. And they match it against memories of every previous initiative in the company, all of which failed to deliver on promise. So you're automatically creating the preconditions of failure. If you run an initiative, you make small changes into the present, and only when things work do you start to announce them. It's far more successful, it's far more resilient. Starting journeys is more effective than setting goals. Because if I start a journey, I will discover things on the journey that I could not have anticipated, which have more benefit to me. I still have structure, I still have discipline, but it's a very different approach. Which leads into this basic concept that praxis makes perfect. If you understand enough about natural science, enough about systems, you can actually act in accordance with the science. And that allows you to actually act without prior cases under conditions of uncertainty. We need a new generation of generalists. And I'll give you one example, something I would really like to reintroduce into schools. When I was at the age of 11, firstly, we were formally taught rhetoric. Kids should be taught rhetoric because then they would not be able to fall to demagogues quite as easily as they do these days. Yeah, if you understand the tools of rhetoric, you can see them when they're being practiced. But the other thing is every week we had to present to the class for 7 minutes on a subject without notice. And we had to take a side. I remember the first time I did it, I'm 11, all right? I stand up in front of the class, I get given a card, and it says, you support capital punishment. Something which, and again, no apologies for this, I think capital punishment is a sign of a barbaric society. Yeah? So I fundamentally oppose this. But I've now got to argue the case for 7 minutes. And we did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. That made us generalists. We never knew what we were going to get hit with, so we read many things. Also, we understood how to argue and how to see through the blandishments of demagogues. And we're losing that capacity within society. And really, we need to start to rethink management. Yeah? This is the origin of the word manage in English. It's from the Italian. It actually comes from the ability to ride a horse in dressage. It then gets corrupted by the French. Well, many things have been corrupted by the French. Not as many as have been corrupted by the English, but still a lot. And to become household management. And we need to start to think about management as riding horses, not actually managing a household budget. It's a very different way of thinking. With that, we get modern techniques. This is called distributed ethnography, a major tool we parallel. This is from work we're doing in Africa, where young girls who've been sexually molested are acting as ethnographers to people at risk in their own community and self-interpreting their own experiences so they're no longer dependent on the expert and they can find solutions on a peer-to-peer basis. This stuff is really exciting because we distribute power into the actual communities and allow different things to happen. Then it allows some quite interesting things. This is a map of attitudes to safety in a company. The vertical dimension on it is basically rule compliance. The horizontal dimension is job completion. The left is civilian manufacture, the right is military manufacture. Yeah? It's based on thousands of micro-observations of engineers as they do their day-to-day work. It's not a survey, it's not an expert, it's the day-to-day observations of engineers. You can see in civilian, you either get the job done or you follow the rules. The two are mutually incompatible. Every focus group, every interview, every questionnaire says they're doing both because they know that's what they're meant to say. But the day-to-day reality is different. On the right, it looks more hopeful. You've got a big pattern in the top right. But that's military. You check on it, it's nuclear weapons testing. That creates a context in which rule compliance and job completion is an existential factor and motivator which can't translate outside that environment. We then got the job done, ignore the rules. And this really scary one, we're just surviving. We're seeing the same pattern in care-orientated staff in hospitals and companies. People who are responsible for customer care are locked into such rigid rule constraints, they can't provide customer care because the rules don't allow it. We're seeing it with nurses, with teachers, and many other people. But then if I want to change this, the top right is too far away. That's been the problem with systems thinking. It's been the problem with knowledge management, declaring idealistic goals about how things should be and creating perpetual disappointment. You can see on the right where the two blue arrows are pointing. That's called an adjacent possible. It's a cluster of observations which is in a better place than where we are. So I click on that cluster, I look at the observations, and I say at a board level, because this side is a board level, what can we as a board do today to create more observations like this and fewer observations like that? That is a whole new theory of change. But then each factory unit has their own map. We're no longer running a program over the whole company. Everybody has a contextual map based on the same source data about their own area. This is called fractal management. So they're nudging the system in directions appropriate. And all of those individual nudges may appear to be incoherent, but they're all coming from the same source data and they map up to a change. Average programs don't achieve change. Contextual interventions based on action do. And asking your workers, what can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that, engages people. Saying, how do we create a knowledge-sharing culture is a foolish abstraction. What can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? And that's the quote for you if you want a measurement. So to finish off, this is the big program we're about to launch. Probably it's going to start in Wales. We've already run it experimentally. The goal here is to have every child at the age of 16 in every school in the world go into their community every month and gather narratives of what care and concerns those communities have. And this is a quantitative method, not a qualitative method, so that data is instantly available to statistical search. That also allows, for example, and we've done this, a child gathers stories from their father who's doing farming work in Ethiopia. They then say, are there any other stories like mine? And they find stories from the Philippines and Colombia, and they synthesize that to come up with a unique approach. It's called peer-to-peer knowledge flow. We initially experimented on that by the US Army, by the way. Peer-to-peer knowledge flow is much more effective than knowledge mediated through best practice documents, in terms of the way I can encounter it. It also means we can simulate that network to ask questions in real time, and critically, it is a statistically valid representation of the polis, rather than he who shouts loudest on social media. And watch the news over the next few months, right? The amount of tweets in the American political election which were bot-generated or generated by teams of people is scarily high. We've created an engine of destruction, not an engine of collaboration in social computing. Yeah? Anything an algorithm can anything an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm can create. So for everybody who is making their knowledge management programs based on technology, you are doing infinite damage if you just depend on the technology and you don't have human agents within the system. And kind of like the final slide, I started with Lincoln, so I'll finish with Jefferson. The democracy will cease to exist when you take away from those who are willing to work and give to those who wouldn't not. Look at income disparity. Look at the way that we have disenfranchised whole groups of people. Look at the way that techno-fetishism is seeking to deprive anybody of meaningful work on the gaze of progress. If we don't find ways to engage with the ordinary day-to-day lives of people, whether in companies or societies, then we have a new barbarism on our hands. And I apologize for being serious, but we are in a period of massive flux and change. And the small things that we all do now will have a profound effect on our survivability over the next few decades. Thank you very much for your time.